Thank you, everybody, for joining our webinar. Excited to get going here. My name is Heather Hornor. I'm the Senior VP of Product here at Form.IO, joined by Travis Tidwell, our CTO. And let's kick it off. So our webinar today is Unlocking Form.IO, a deep dive into the tech that powers modern applications. We're excited for you all to join, and we can dive in deeper about the tech behind the platform and have some fun discussing some different topics that have been relevant for us and are hopefully relevant for you as well. I am recording this and will send a link to all the attendees, and it will also be on YouTube. We will have a Q&A available for you. Please, and put any questions in that Q&A along the way, and we will answer them at the end or in line as we go. All right. I'm going to start by just talking a little bit about what people are up to that we're talking to all the time to kick this off. Our prospects and customers are coming to us in the context of an ongoing digital transformation of some kind. And what are the drivers for this? Often it's maybe a stale UX or mobilization and accessibility requirements, reaching new audiences, reaching more people, new functionality that's been added, or reducing costs because of process automation or improvements, data security requirements that are ever evolving, and performance and scalability. If we think about what Form.IO is used for, it is a tool in a tool belt to build something larger. That something larger is an application or a technology platform. Within any application or platform, there are things that are relevant, like authentication and authorization, the UI and UX, the APIs for that application that connect it to any backend systems, the integrations into both legacy and new systems, as well as the databases that are implicated. And at every step of the way, forms are part of all of these, from logging into an application to navigating from workflow to workflow. Everything you do in an app ends up being some kind of form, from a bank application, from your email, from chats. These are often forms. And Form.IO is used as a tool to standardize a lot of these processes. Today, I'd like to talk about a little bit of why Form.IO was created, what problems it solves, and what you would do if you didn't have Form.IO versus with Form.IO. To start that off, Travis, I'd love to hand it over to you to discuss a little bit of that comparison of what happens when you don't have Form.IO versus what happens when you do have Form.IO, and why that is sort of a tech behind the tech or magic tool that people use.
Yes, thanks, Heather. First of all, just a quick introduction. My name is Travis Tidwell. Thank you so much for that great introduction, Heather. So what I'd like to really touch on, in fact, I'm going to be covering a lot of the technical aspects of Form.IO. You know, I would like to first start off by just saying that the audience for this webinar are technical developers or the technical people who are involved with some type of form building or form management or even application development process within your organization. Because of that, some of the things that I'm going to talk about are going to be fairly technical. Now, I'm going to do the best I can to try and make it in such a way so that everyone, no matter where you are in the organization, can understand. But in order to really deep dive into the technology, one of the biggest questions that comes to us, especially whenever I'm working with developers, is, okay, great, I want to adopt Form.IO, but I also want to build my own application. I don't want to just wholly use Form.IO and therefore relinquish all control to Form.IO. I want to have an enormous amount of control to build the application that I want to build, while at the same time adopting all of these amazing capabilities that Form.IO has to offer. And because of this, there's always a big question as to where is that line between where my application begins or where my application ends and where Form.IO begins. In order to communicate that, we actually worked up a little visual that I think will help the developers in the audience to explain what your application looks like without Form.IO. And then I'm going to do a really quick comparison on what it would look like with Form.IO. So let's imagine you're a developer and you're building a React application for your organization. And this React application has a number of forms that you would like to incorporate. And these forms are visually shown at certain URLs. So let's say you go to Form A at one URL, and that shows this form. And then you go to Form B in your URL of your application, and that shows this form. If I'm a developer and I am not using Form.IO, but I also want to build a React application, most developers in this case would probably find themselves gravitating toward an amazing form technology called Formic. It is a front-end form rendering platform. And you would actually build out the view using this Formic technology, and you would have an on-submit handler. That on-submit handler, and of course, keep in mind, every single view for every different field would effectively be written by a developer, HTML, even though you're using a framework, you're still writing HTML. That would then call an on-submit handler where you would then send a post request to some API, and that API would have to be developed by another developer, typically a back-end developer, who writes all the routes inside of, let's say you're using Express.js and Node.js, and all of these routes are going to receive that request and then ultimately submit the data into the database. Now, in this visual, I'm showing two forms, which is reasonable. But a lot of the customers that we're dealing with are customers that have thousands of forms. And not only thousands of forms, thousands of highly complex forms, where maybe instead of 3 fields in the form, you may have hundreds. And not only that, but each field is conditionally shown or hidden based on other conditions in the form, and you have thousands of those. What do you do? Well, that's where this type of approach starts to really show the flaws of being able to manage this application. And so with Form.IO, what it actually looks like is Form.IO provides the developers a two-part solution. I like to describe it. The first part of our solution is actually inside of your application. We actually have an open source, and I want to make sure I highlight that word, open source JavaScript rendering technology, which actually makes it so you just have a single line of code, and that single line of code can dynamically point to different sources of forms. And each of those sources is an independent JSON object that is fed to our renderer to render the form. And so instead of building multiple views, you have a single view, and it's dictated by a variable, which would be the API source of the form that you're pointing to. You also don't even need a controller. Most people would probably have controllers because they want to customize the business rules or the logic of the form, but you don't need it because those APIs go directly to the other side of our technology stack, which is the API platform of Form.IO, which handles the submissions and stores all the data in the databases. And again, all of this is within your own environment. It's embedded within your own solution inside of your own technology. And that gives you the benefit of having this database in your own environment, as well as connect to your own services. So Heather, I hope that helps at least provide a visual to the developers of how you would end up using Form.IO in your application.
Yes, absolutely. And from there, I'd love to go into a little bit of the technical architecture and talk about how does Form.IO work? One of the things that comes up a lot is the decoupling of like form management from data management. And I want to dive into that a little bit deeper. And one of the things that has come up in a lot of different industries and different conversations we've had is people having this view either from legacy technologies or from applications that they built themselves that like the form is the data. Like we were at a conference, if you remember, in Vegas, an insurance conference, and people kept coming up to our booth saying, "You guys do document management, document management." And we were like, what? Like we were clearly we're saying forms, 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 and they're going document management. And then we realized this is a little bit of an industry thing, but also just a little bit of a technology thing and the insurance industry is famous for this. A form is a PDF and it is a document. So each form is a single entity of a document. And then what creates the document management problem is having to store these individual documents somewhere. So people are looking to us and saying, do you do document management? And the answer to that really was no, not the way you're saying it, but actually, if you look at the Form.IO technology and how it's set up, you avoid that problem entirely. And so I'd love to talk a little bit about that and maybe start with form management. And how to see that.
Well, yeah, before I dive into like maybe let's say form management, data management, I would actually kind of like to do a little bit of a deep dive into the concepts that Form.IO employs to separate the forms from the JSON. There's another diagram that I have here that I'd like to just start off by showing, which is kind of an understanding of how to conceptually think about Form.IO. So first and foremost, Form.IO is a JSON strategy. When you adopt Form.IO, you are effectively adopting a strategy that JSON, which is JavaScript object notation, is the data structure that you would like to use as the common language between everything in your technology stack, from front end to server, all the way to database. JSON is that common language. We actually use this to our advantage at Form.IO. And we do this by effectively breaking apart what would normally be thought of as a single form entity into really two distinct JSON objects. The first thing to note here is that it all really begins when you build a form. So the first thing we do is we hand, and I'll talk about this more in a minute, we hand this form builder, this very capable form building technology that's drag and drop, makes it super easy. It can be done by anyone, even non-developers. The ability to create and manage forms. I'll talk about that later in a minute. But ultimately, what the developers then do, which as I explained before, is you embed that form within your own application. Now, this application is driven really by two different JSON objects or two different APIs. One that handles the forms and the other that handles the submissions. Now, we actually have a demo application that kind of illustrates how this operates. And actually to get to this demo, you can go to this URL up here, and you can actually follow along with me to kind of see for yourself how all of this comes together. If you click on this form builder link, one thing that you'll see is that we have this little form builder, and you can actually drag and drop fields onto the form here. And what I'm going to do is just add two fields. I'm going to add first name, last name. Now you can imagine that this could be as complex as you would want it to be. This could be hundreds of fields. But what this does really well at is it gives you this visual of what the form ultimately ends up looking like as a JSON model. So whenever you build a form, our form builder is really a glorified JSON schema builder. But what's really interesting is now that you've got this JSON form definition, you're ultimately going to embed that form into your application. So going back to this diagram, you now have this form embedded in your application, and this is a JavaScript library that renders that JSON dynamically in the application where the end user now fills out this form. And so this would be like rendered in your application. Now this would be, if you can imagine, like let's say this little gray area is the tablet interface, and the person comes in and they start typing their name. Well, this produces the second critical object that we call the submission. And this is a completely separate object from the forms, the submission and the JSON. And so this actually, this separation is very, very important because this allows us to take forms as discrete entities that can also, and this is a really important word here, managed separately from the runtime operation of the form. And that this separation between managing forms, which is really just managing the JSON produced by the builder, and managing the data, which is really managing this JSON, are now can be conceptualized as two different things: form management and data management. And so let's actually focus on form management. And this is what your question was, Heather. You was like, okay, let's talk about the form management elements of Form.IO. To do that, I'd like to actually show you what happens after you embed a form into Form.IO. As soon as you embed a form into Form.IO, this is done by a developer. A developer takes that single line of code and they plop that into their application. What effectively can happen now is we've effectively decoupled form management from software development release cycles. And let me just kind of explain a little bit what that means. So historically, and I actually showed you the before and after. In fact, I can even show that diagram right now. Let's imagine you are in this world and you wanted to release some changes to this form. Well, what you would have to do, especially the developers in this world, is they would have to submit a pull request to the application. That would have to go through a QA process. You would have to create versions. You'd have to release it, come out with a scheduled release process just to, for example, make a field required. And it was extremely painful. So what Form.IO allows you to do is it allows you to separate that. So now there's this one single line of code. The source is really pointing to the API endpoint of the form. And now you can hand over that form management and building process to non-developers who now can build and manage the forms within the application. And of course, they can also, going through some staging capabilities, release those forms into the wild. But ultimately, they are separate. They're a separate process between software releases and form management. One interesting thing that comes about with this, whenever you build your applications this way, is let's imagine you have millions of tablets out in the wild that have your forms deployed on them. And now you need to make some changes to those forms. Historically, you would have to submit a new application version, and then you would hope that everyone updates their application. You almost have to like send an email, a blast email. Everybody update your application. With Form.IO, you don't have to do that. All of those people can have the same version or even different versions of the application. And because you deployed the change to the form separate, all they have to do is the next time that they click on that form in all of the tablets, they will all see the correct form, which is an amazing thing to see, especially whenever you start deploying and utilizing Form.IO.
Yeah, and that's because the Form API is one of the APIs that's shipped with the enterprise platform, right? And that is dynamically pulling that latest version of the form into the application without you having to touch it. And I think that, and also another point in that is that the developer portal application, we talk about a little bit for form management. It's the application that ships with our enterprise platform that is the interface that allows you to build and manage those forms, right? And so I like to separate when we talk about our portal application as really this back admin office tool that allows teams to come in and collaborate on these forms and really isn't what is facing the customer. What's facing the customer is your application that you're building. And then you use this as this tool for collaboration for those forms that will be embedded into the app that leverage that API that ships with the platform.
Yeah, I've just got a really quick demo to kind of just show that right now. So like right here, we've got this project. This is the HR portal project, and I'm currently viewing this benefits enrollment form. As Heather was just briefly mentioning, this UI that we see here, we call this the developer portal. However, it's also used by non-developers as well. I mean, we should say what it is. We have tons of customers that have very happy form building teams, non-developers that use our developer portal to build and manage these forms. But let's say that you have an application. Now, I've got an application here that's built in Angular. It's a separate application. And let's say that this would be like your application for employees to use for their internal HR application. Here is this form right here that loads inside of this application. This is embedded in the application. Now the form builder can just come in here and let's just say that they wanted to add a few more things. Like for example, they wanted to add like a little select box that would say like, you know, what plan like to register for, and they can just, you know, health or life. And let's just say they just add like a little a checkbox here. All they have to do is publish that form, and immediately whenever I come over to the application and hit refresh, I did not have to redeploy this application. I didn't have to rebundle it. I did not have to re-release it. As soon as I went back to that form, that new field is ready to go, which is really cool. Like, you know, you don't have to, the software developers can effectively wipe their hands clean of having to deal and manage forms, which is great.
It is great. Although let's call it out. We're going to be very responsible and we're not going to do things in prod, right? No testing in prod. So tell me a little bit, Travis, about preventing that chaos.
Yeah, great point. Obviously, for demo reasons, I had to do it fast,
Yeah.
but nobody would do what I just did. And it's for that reason we actually have some abilities in the developer portal to separate out your project. And so whenever I say project, what I'm talking about is this little icon here. A project keeps your inventory of forms. It keeps your inventory of resources. A project is also associated with what is called the API endpoint of your project, which you can see right up here. It's just form.local human resources. This is just a local deployment that I have. But ultimately, this would be considered live. I would never want to push changes to live. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to go over to settings and I'm going to put live in what's called protected mode. What protected mode does is it does not allow any changes to be made to this stage. And so as soon as I put this into protected mode, now you'll see a little shield by it. I cannot make changes. If I wanted to come in here and do that, it's not going to let me. It's basically in read-only mode. So now the big question is, okay, well, how do I get changes into production? That is where stages come into play. Form.io has this amazing staging capability where I can create stages based off of any stage that you want. In this case, let's say we base it off of live, and let's just create a dev stage. And this dev stage, you'll notice it has its own endpoint. So if I'm building a dev application that needs to point to the dev stage, it really is as easy as just pointing all of the APIs to this endpoint versus pointing them to production. But now if I want to make a change to any form, I would go in, I would make that change. And then what I would do is go over to the staging section where I would then create a new version. So like, let's say I want to create a 1.3.4. I'm going to create a 1.3.4, and this would say modified the benefits form. I would create that version, and now I've got this version that can be deployed to production. But here's the big benefit of this. I now have a rollback strategy. And I also have an audit trail of what happened, what things have changed. I can click on this, and then let's say I want to deploy this to production. I can go to the live environment. You go to staging, go to manage versions, click on this, deploy. And as soon as I do this, this would now deploy all of the forms that were in dev into the live stage. Now this does, it's like a bulk update, and it's like a deterministic version that stamps every single form, every single version. It's a great feature.
Thank you for that. I also want to go a little bit into um, for a next step even of on a per form basis. And so we have the ability to control these different versions in multitudes of ways, right? And so each then form also can have this granular control about its versioning.
Right. Yeah. So, and actually, let me, before I can show that, let me actually take this out of protected mode. I'm gonna do the evil thing here. and get it out of protected mode so I can show you all of these things. So everything that I've showed you so far is how you would get stages deployed to other stages. Another thing, an amazing feature that Form.IO has to offer is the ability to keep track of independent form changes that we call form revisions. Now, there's really two killer features of form revisions. The first killer feature is that I have this ability to keep track of every single change that was made to each independent form. So that if anything messes up or if anything that I made a change of, I don't want that, I can always go back and restore previous revisions. I can also click on this link here to see what the JSON of the form is at that revision. So the other great thing is you also have API ability to actually fetch the form at that revision. And guess what? This can also be used to embed forms that are pinned to a specific version. Now, let's say if I'm a developer and I've got this form and I want to pin it. I don't want anybody to mess with it. I want to pin it and I want that URL to always be that form. You absolutely can use these version IDs in this version API endpoint as your pin. We even have customers that take this to the next level where they have like a manifest file, and that manifest file is an inventory of all their forms, and it's the version URLs, the version IDs and endpoints of all of the forms, and they commit that to Git. And so therefore they use version control in addition with the Form.io platform to create deterministic releases for all of their software releases. And it's a really great thing to do because now you're using a combination of version control within your application in addition to the Form.io versions of the forms to create this deterministic release. The other killer feature, if you want me to talk about that, if we have time, Heather, what do you think?
I would go for it quickly, and then I'd like to give my non-developer view on form revisions, and we're going to then go into the
Okay.
back end stuff.
Nice. So the other really killer feature of form revisions, and I think this is the biggest one, is this solves a really hard problem that a lot of agencies and organizations struggle with, which is that your forms inevitably will change year over year. They'll change, sometimes they'll change dramatically, especially government forms. But you've got this backlog of data of people who have submitted historical versions of forms. And how do you reconcile the problem of going, if I make a change to a form, how can I go back to a historical submission and view that submission as it was submitted if the form has changed? Form revision solves this problem because we store the revision ID along with that data object. Remember, we have that separate data object. So when you pull up a submission, you can view it through the lens of the revision ID. It's a really cool feature.
Absolutely. That's exactly why, like when these conversations with document management and all the other implications of when a form and a submission are the same entity rather than being separated, it really is that answer to that of you avoid a lot of these problems in the first place by viewing a form not as the data, but as a lens in which you view the data, just like you're saying, right? And so then each one of these on your screen here, whatever the version is, you can view it, the data that exists already through that lens or the previous lens, or however that might be appropriate. And it avoids this conundrum that you have when the data and the form are exactly the same entity.
Mm-hmm.
I want to move into submission data and data management. How does Form.io manage and process submission data? And what I want to get into really, and in the interest of time, we've got about 15 minutes left, I want to have one question really answered. We talk about how Form.io is a combined form and data management platform. And this is very true in a lot of ways. But it also can be a little bit of a misnomer, I think, from what people's expectations are. We have an API called the Submission API that handles submission data, and that does one thing, right? But a lot of people have their own APIs or they have other things that they want to integrate with. And I want to just make that differentiation of those two ideas and how we think about them.
Yeah, so it's really important to maybe even talk about, the very interesting thing that Form.IO did. And now we already talked about the one interesting thing, which is separating forms from the data. But the other thing that it does is it actually heavily leverages this separation between client and server. So that not only is the forms and data separated, let's call that a horizontal separation. There's also a vertical separation between the client, which is the application, and the data. You can actually use this to your advantage, especially if you're a developer. And the way that you would actually do that is you would actually leverage the JavaScript renderer capabilities. Now, when you embed a form into your application, in fact, I can just show you a couple of examples of how you would embed a form into your application. So like, for example, we got this hosted form here. One thing that you can actually do by just embedding the form, so this actually will render the form at this URL. However, you can populate it with your own data just using JavaScript. This is where you get the benefits of the horizontal separation, because now let's say that data I have in my application already, I want to pre-populate a Form.IO form with data that I already have. Here you go. It's very easy just to submit it. The other thing that you get benefit from the vertical separation is, let's say that you wish to submit this data to your own endpoint. So now, okay, I've got my form, but now whenever the form submits, I want to basically stop it from submitting to Form.IO. And instead, I want it to submit to my own API. This right here tells the renderer, hey, don't submit to Form.IO. This actually listens for them to click the submit button, which goes through validations and all of that on the front end. And this shows how I can just send a post request from the client to whatever endpoint that I want. And by taking advantage of that separation, you really do open up the doors of being able to integrate with a wide range of API endpoints, including your own.
Yep. And I love this because it shows really from like a code perspective what's going on. It's also in our developer portal. There's a ton of UI surrounding actions and webhooks and managing those connections. So it's not, I don't want to, I love this just to show it, but I also want to just call out that the developer portal, one of the, I'll call it the killer features of it, is you're managing a lot of these data connections on a perform basis, on a project basis, but those integrations are saved and managed within the project, within the portal application, and it gives you a UI to, like, on the save submission, you're then saving to the MongoDB that it's, or equivalent that it's attached to. And then the webhooks can allow you then to go to any other endpoint, and we have a UI to manage that.
One question, I'm glad you brought this up, because one question that a lot of developers have is, hey, what's the difference between doing the post request that you just showed me, Travis, in the client versus a webhook? What's the difference? The client is a direct client to your service connection. You can completely bypass the Form.IO submission APIs altogether. So think of that as like a bypass, and you're going directly to your own APIs. The webhook actually leverages the submission APIs as you would normally see it, which includes server-side validations. It's data processing on the server. There's a lot of configurations that require processing on the server. So all of that is handled by Form.IO, and then a webhook is a connection from the server to your service. So you can actually do the server-to-server communication to finally hand off that submission to whatever Lambda function that you write, or maybe you have your own backend services. It's a really powerful feature, but there's use cases for both. Like I write plenty of applications where I'm using the client approach, and I write plenty of applications where I'm using the webhook approach.
Thank you for that. Yeah. And I think it's one of these things too, where it's like, you don't have to do anything. I have this saying with Form.IO, it's not if, it's how, right? And there's an appropriate use for all of these different scenarios. And it's a very powerful platform. And even if it's because of the, we see a lot, the teams that are managing all these forms and having that form management at their fingertips as an enterprise tool to build a larger context of applications is very powerful. And then the data management and workflow capabilities that we enable within an application are also the other side of that. I want to talk a little bit too about, I know we had a question in the Q&A come up about workflow and data after this, workflow after the submission of data.
Mhm.
I think like this speaks a little bit to that of, you
Yeah.
can submit it to any endpoint or whatever you want, but maybe give a very short rundown on that.
Yeah, so the way, and I'm going to try to be very quick about how you can achieve workflow. If you think of a form and a submission as a state, and a workflow is really a state machine, you can actually leverage Form.IO as the part of the workflow where you kick that state along by putting the submission in different states. So what's very common is an approval workflow. So let's say you're looking at this benefits enrollment form. In fact, I'm just going to use this format as an example. One of these emails that gets sent out is to the HR administrator. And so you'll see right here, it's going over SMTP. We come over here and we tell the HR administrator, hey, you got this new submission. Well, instead of just sending them the data, we also have an option where you can send them the link back to the submission where they can view the data. They can even add their own data to it and click submit. That ultimately puts it in a different state. And that in combination with a thing called action conditionals. So like right now we've got this email, but you can also attach conditions to actions. So you could say, I want to send this email when the form is in the pre-approval state, and I want to send this email when the form is in the approved state. And so to achieve workflow, you have to think of forms as really a state processing system. And the submission, the data as the state. And so the form can change that state willingly, and actions can be triggered conditionally based on the data of that state. So you can easily achieve workflow in workflow situations with a combination of webhooks, emails, and also just the form embedding.
Yeah. And I would also say we're commonly like we are a tool to standardize forms within an application. We see it very commonly too that people use a workflow standardization tool or workflow or process orchestration tool like Camunda or others. That Form.IO sits in that ecosystem, and it's not a competition, but a very complementary relationship within an application. So there's a lot you can do with that. If you're saying, well, that sounds Form.IO centric, I was thinking of something different. Totally. Like that can be accomplished, absolutely. And they're very complementary together. And we see it all the time. It's kind of a little bit of a how, not an if. I would like to talk sort of before we wrap up here, two things. One, if you could talk about how do I get data into a form? Secondly, how do I get data out of a form?
Yeah, I can talk about data in very quickly because I want to give you plenty of time to talk about how to get data out.
Perfect.
The renderer is how you get data into the form. And the renderer, it can be done in a multitude of ways. When you build a form in the developer portal, you get this little tab here called Embed. This is your page for developers that want to get this form into an application that can be used by an end user. And there's a multitude of ways that we allow you to embed. One that you've already seen, which is our JavaScript renderer, which you just, attach the form, create form, and just pass this URL. You also, let's just say you want just an easy one line piece of code to get your form in your application. Let's say you're using a CMS. We have this thing called quick inline embed, where I can just copy this little blip of code here, and like I can take this over to like a little code pen. And as soon as I run that, you'll see that it now embedded that form. And this is a working form. This is completely ready to go. It's going to validate. It's going to do everything using one single line of code to get that into my application. So that's actually getting the form into your application. We also work with a number of frameworks like Angular, React. We have libraries already out there that you can npm install to get these forms embedded into your Angular applications. And once those have been embedded, you now have this automatic connection between the form and the data that is actually in the API behind it. So in fact, let me just go ahead and just submit this really quick so you can see this. I'm just going to skip over a bunch of fields here, and I'm going to inspect the network here, and I'm going to click submit. You'll see that by just embedding the form, that one line of code, if I click submit, it immediately knows that it should send a post request to my stage for that form under submission. And this post request is going to send this data, the data object, and here is the response from the endpoint that gives me the ID of the submission and all of that. And now that I've got all of that data, it's now the job of our other tools that we have to get data out. And it all really starts with the APIs. Like, for example, we have a data table, and then I'll hand it over to you. You can easily embed our data table into your own applications, which actually utilizes our APIs. In fact, if I hit refresh here, this actually uses the API endpoints to fetch data, which you can see here's all the submissions for this form, to visualize in a grid view. And from this, I think I'd like to hand it over to you, Heather, for you to talk about, okay, how do we get data out of Form.IO?
Yeah. And I think I want to concentrate on an extension from that. So I'll share my screen here. Out of the data table, which was a component originally, we had a little bit of a problem statement. We were sitting here and going, we're this very robust, powerful platform and tool that people are using to build applications for everything called building forms, collecting data securely, connecting, through to any other third-party systems or APIs. And we had a really great answer to this. This is all embedded in your own environment. And people were coming to us and saying, well, what about reporting on that data? What does that mean? And how can Form.IO help me? And initially we had that submission grid, the data table, and it is a front end grid that you can load submission data into. And we took that to the next level with our reporting module. And the reporting module is really an extension of our own identity already. What are we as a tool? We leverage MongoDB and JSON, and we have this developer portal that does all this really cool stuff to create, save, and modify and leverage JSON. And the reporting UI the reporting module is an extension of that. It sits on top of the MongoDB aggregation pipeline and allows you to take data from multiple sources, multiple forms, and aggregate that together to then display it in a controllable and customizable UI in that grid. So here, I'm in the developer portal here. I'm inside one of my projects. So in our latest versions and additions to forms and resources and that what you're used to, we have this reports. And reports are in this developer portal are the setup and the configuration. So this is the UI for me to configure what I want in here, and the name and the forms that you want to join together within this report, and calculated columns. There's a lot of really cool stuff that you can do to add in data that really is just a calculation between two fields from two different forms. So doesn't even exist until the report exists, which is very powerful. And aggregating all that together. And then also from the control of the UI of what columns exist overall, and then what columns exist by default. What does that do? That gives the user, the end user, whoever's logging into your app where the report is embedded, they have the control to see what they want to see. And then we have a control panel, call it, where we have filters and actions and the columns that exist so the end user can control them. I have an example here where it's just sample data, obviously, but I'll show you like the columns. We have this difference between the available columns and the default columns. The second I hit update, it's immediately there because this is JSON. Everything's available to you in the client to make these configuration changes quickly. And then you can then select rows of data if you want and execute actions. We have a couple defaults, but this could have custom actions where you're sending data or sending these report rows to some other third-party system, enabling a ton of workflow as well. And so data is not just trapped behind a form at the end of a submission API. You have it available to you now to have really robust reports. And I think I'm going to end there for today and just say thank you, everyone, for attending and coming to our webinar. We're going to have some more of these with different product announcements and diving deeper into different technical topics, and we'll let you know about them. And we really appreciate you coming by today. Thank you so much and have a great day.
I got a suggestion for the next one, Heather.
What's that?
PDFs.
I'm in. Let's do it.
Let's go.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.